Hello, everyone, and welcome to the workshop on placing the narrator at the center, designing co-created oral history projects. We've re-recorded the view of the earlier slides from the presentation because the pre-recording had some technical issues. So we started off our workshop welcoming participants and asking everyone to share their name and location. I'm currently in Egypt, so that's where I am. And we did a quick Menti survey of everyone's field of study and work just to get a feel of everyone's background. And as you can see, we've had quite a diverse range of participants. We've had interests and backgrounds in oral history, anthropology, community organizing, public history, education, journalism, librarianship, photography, human geography, youth community, gender-based violence. There's so much here. So we've had quite an interesting group of participants. A little bit about my own background and studies. So I did my undergrad in political science. I have a bachelor's of science in political science from Cairo University here in Egypt. And I did my master's in oral history through the OMA program at Columbia University. I graduated in 2019. I did my field research for my thesis in Puerto Rico, and I focused on interviewing individuals who've had experiences with Hurricane Maria. And my focus in the study was mostly on, their experiences with the hurricane itself, but also a focus on their life in the aftermath of the hurricane and how they've been adapting to life and how they were able to find motivation and strength in the aftermath. And I was trying to be a bit experimental with the form of production of my research. So I created this manual called Forsa, which is a reflective manual of activities inspired by the stories I've heard from the different individuals and narrators I interviewed. And it's an attempt at creating a set of activities that can help individuals become reflective of their own experiences post-change and trying to find strength to build a new routine moving forward. For the past year, I've been working on this project, which is called the Education 2.0 Research and Documentation Project. So for the past couple of years, Egypt has been experiencing nationwide educational reforms. And this project still aims at documenting this change and this policy change. And so a part of the project that I was working on handled doing oral histories, and we were doing interviews with policymakers to try and understand how policy reform can happen while it's happening. And also on another note, we were doing interviews with parents, students, and teachers on how they're being affected by these changes on the ground. So this is a little bit about me. For the workshop, what we're going to focus on are two main things. So the first point is, how can we place the narrator at the center? Hoping that by placing the narrator at the center, we can challenge stereotype narratives, since we're giving the narrator the space to share their story in the way that they want to share it. And the other level is assuming that we have the narrator at the center and that the narrator is engaged, can we also maybe engage the narrator in the process of project design and production? So not just being placed at the center of the interview, but also the center possibly of the whole oral history process. We'll be doing also some open discussions in breakout rooms, and there will be some time in the end for a Q&A. Now, some themes that are going to be running throughout the session that we're going to be talking about regularly are the ideas of co-creation, shared authority, and reciprocity. So we will explore a little bit in depth what we mean by these concepts. So just so we have a common grounding of what I mean by oral history, and this is specifically, it's a bit simplified for the purposes of this workshop. But in general, what we mean by oral history is that we want to document an event or a situation or an experience, so something that has happened for an individual or a group of individuals. So it could be a personal experience, like someone who has lived in a certain space for a long time, and we want to interview him about his reflections in life within the space, or someone who has, experienced like a new job, and we want to document their story about this. So something very specific. or it could be something that's experienced by a group of individuals together, such as any national changes. So like the education reform that I was working on, or any political disruptions or natural disasters, or COVID, what we're experiencing right now. So this is something that's experienced by a collective group of people. So even though each individual has their own experience with the situation, but it is something that we are collectively experiencing together. One thing to keep in mind is that this circle around the individual is also what the individual brings with him within the interview and within the oral history process. So for the individual, I always think that it's the person's own experiences, beliefs, sets of values, upbringing, education, thoughts on life and opinions in general. So you can't really separate that from the individual. And with the collective group, it's the same, also bringing in social structures, economic situation, political situation. So that also comes into account whenever we're doing an oral history conversation or interview. And one other thing to keep in mind is the role of memory. So most of the work that we do within oral histories is very dependent on the individual's memory and how they would like to share their story, but also how they're remembering this event or situation and how they would like us to document it. So this is just so we have the common grounding about, I mean by oral history whenever we talk about this later. And when we talk about placing the narrator at the center, I think it's also important to think that within the oral history process, we can't really take out our positioning as researchers or as oral historians. So when we say we want to place the narrator at the center, that doesn't mean that we have no role as researchers or interviewers. So what I mean by placing the narrator at the center is that we also acknowledge that it's an ongoing conversation between the narrator and us, and between, so the interviewee and the interviewer, and that each of us comes in with their own sets of values, opinions, thoughts, backgrounds, intentions, and all that. Because again, as researchers and as oral historians, we also conduct the interview because we want to build up into something. So we're either working on a project or hoping to collect shared stories or narratives on a certain topic. So we also have our own goals for this interview. So what I mean by placing the narrator at the center is that maybe, so we acknowledge this, that it's two ways, but also that we try to figure out how we can maybe minimize our influence on this conversation and give more space for the narrator to lead the conversation and lead the direction, at least of the discussion and narrative. So we'll do a quick poll on if anyone has ever been interviewed before and felt that they were placed at the center of the shared narrative. So it's a yes and no. So have you ever gone through an interview within any setting where you felt like you really had the space to share your own thoughts and like came out of the interview saying like, this really brought everything out for me? And we'll have a quick discussion after on like what we think might have helped with that.
The whole person, which I really genuinely appreciated. And it helped her, I think, tie in, really get a good picture of all of the things that make me who I am. And I really appreciated that.
Thank you. So questions mainly, you feel like her questions were informed and gave you space to share, right? Okay, wonderful, thanks.
So I was one of your no's. And one of the few times whenever I've been the subject and not the interviewer, I really felt like what the interviewer wanted was, they had their set expectation of here's the soundbite I want to get from you. And so I've always tried, in my own, anytime I'm trying to figure out how to, construct really good questions, really powerful questions, I always try and remember how that felt as an interviewer, to know that no, they weren't actually listening to what I was saying. They had a specific way they wanted me to go and steer this interview. And so it's been helpful, but it was also, not the best interview to be part of.
Fair enough. Yeah, which I think is always a challenge, like, because you do want to hear a certain thing sometimes, and it's a bit, you have to remind yourself that you need to stop doing that and be more open when you're listening. Thank you. I'm going to read some of the, also like what people had shared in the chat. So the interviewer was flexible and asked great follow-up questions and picking up on subtle cues. Interviewer talked to me in advance to try and understand how the interview would be helpful. So a bit of preparation and maybe touching base before. I was interviewed for a PhD dissertation. The candidate was seeking specific information, so there wasn't a dialogue. Okay, so maybe try to do more of a dialogue. Having enough time and not feeling like they were trying to get something out of me on a deadline. Yeah, which I also think is a big challenge, especially when you're doing this within a framework of a job or studies where you feel like you really need to get this done. I need to have this interview no matter what. So it puts a bit of pressure on you. That's true. Great. Anyone else wants to share? Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Lauren, I think we can go back to the presentation. Sorry, okay, I'll share some more from the chat. Someone who said no, who is a no, so sorry, just a second. A student interviewed me about my career in oral public history. I given her a copy of my CV and suggested she read a few of the articles I'd written to prepare and press me on some of my ideas. She did not. This was insulting. She brought me a plant as a gift. Very sweet. Right, which, okay, so that's also a very important point. So how much preparation you do, and especially if you're interviewing someone who already has a lot of their work out there. So if you put a bit of research time into it, you'll be able to know some of those, and then you don't have to cover the same thing again in an interview. I think that's definitely very important. A structure for interviewing is the psychoanalytic session. I recommend okay, so there's a recommendation for Freud's father knows best approach. Wonderful, thank you. We'll look into that. And not having enough information about the project and context, for sure. There's a lot of work that's to be put in the preparation phase, for sure. Great, thank you. So for today, what we're going to do, okay, there's one more I want to share. So I really want to give time for this so that we kind of like have it in our mindset already, like what makes it a good interview. During my current participatory oral history project, I initially had to call my impulse to correct narrators because it's an oral history of an organization that we were all a part of. When another narrator asked to interview me, I was happy to have space to be a narrator and not the interviewer. Right, so I think that's also another thing, like what do we do? How do we handle it when we kind of have some of the information in the back of our minds and it's not the first time for us to hear this, or when we're interviewing people that we know really well. So we know what's their story, kind of, and they start saying something different. And you feel like, this is not what you told me before. I want you to say something different. So I agree. I think it's actually really good in some projects where they do interview the researchers in the end, especially if they were part of the experience, because then, as mentioned here, you could actually have the time and space to reflect on what you heard from other people and like what you think is different. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. So for today, I really wanted to try and make it a bit more practical. So I'm hoping
We can't hear you anymore again. Yes, her sound just did cut out. Okay, she's back.
hi, everyone. Sorry again. My I don't know what's going on today. Very bad, very bad energies today.
We're
Okay,
so
sorry.
grateful to have you host. I'm so glad you can do this even in, across the world from us. So thank you.
No, I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on. Okay, sorry.
Okay, I'll wait for you to share. Yeah. So what I was saying was that for today, I was really hoping to make it a bit more practical in terms of me sharing some experiences with projects that I've worked on, and then try to collectively be analytical about it in terms of, again, the different themes that we want to talk about. So my approach to that was that I was thinking to divide or to break down the project into pre, during, and post. So basically, we always think about oral history, again, as centered around the interview. So I was thinking of how it could be done if we think about it as the pre-phase, so the phase before the interview, which some of you had already mentioned, the preparation phase, and then during the interview, and then post the interview. Lauren, if you can press again. So the first theme that we're going to try and see is co-creation. And what I mean by co-creation here, and again, this is a very simplified meaning of the concept, just so you understand what I mean when I say co-creation for the purposes of this session, is basically collaborative creation of content and direction. What I mean by that is how much is the narrator invested and how much space is the narrator given to be able to collaborate in the content itself that we're working on, but also the direction and the general vision of the work. And then the second theme is shared authority. And shared authority is such a big concept. But here, again, for the purposes of this workshop, we're going to talk about it in the sense of the participation in the decision-making process. So how much does the narrator have a say in deciding things? You know, so how much would I as a researcher change my work based on the narrator's opinion or based on what the narrator would tell me? And the third point is reciprocity. And reciprocity is a bit of a big word. I was looking it up on the internet trying to see if there's like a nice short definition for it. And it said like mutual exchange of privileges, which I thought was nice and simple enough, at least for today. But it's the idea of giving back. So for us as researchers, when we do oral history work, we know what we're getting out of it. If it's for work, you're producing a project. If it's for your studies, then you're doing your research. But for the person who's being interviewed, it's not always clear what they're getting out of it, except for them sharing their stories. And it's something interesting to try to put some energy and time and effort into trying to make it more tangible for the narrators. So these are the concepts that we will be moving forward with today. Like, how do we look at a project from pre, during, and post interview process, but also using these three themes. So this is a picture that I had used for the project and for today's workshop, I mean. And it's from an interview that I did for my thesis. And I really enjoyed interviewing these guys. So this is Augusto and Pablo and their siblings. And what was interesting about their interview is that it was completely unplanned, which I think happens in a lot of times when you're doing oral history work. But I was interviewing a friend of theirs. And then I met them because they were having lunch at their house. And they talked about how they were in Puerto Rico at the time of the hurricane, but had to leave to the US after because of what happened in the hurricane. And so I thought it was a wonderful, I thought they had like a wonderful story to share, and I asked them if they wanted to be interviewed, and they agreed, and we did 2 interviews actually. So the first interview I think was more towards what I wanted to ask about. So like, how was their life before the hurricane, during the hurricane, and like post hurricane, which is basically my structure for all my interviews. But then we kind of felt like we had more of the conversation. So we did the second interview, and I think that's when they really kind of spearheaded it. So I had nothing prepared. I told them at the end of the first interview, I told them, you can choose whatever you want to talk about next time. And that's what happened, you know. So one of them is a singer, and he came the second time. He said, I've prepared to sing you a song. And they all came, like both of them came in with like a set of discussion points that they felt were interesting that we didn't cover in the first interview. So in my head, that was always an interview where I feel like, oh my God, that was like completely co-created. And they really had like a really big say in how we moved forward. But let's try and like look at the themes from before and try to analyze that. Lauren, if you can move to the next one, please. Thank you. Okay, So again, so if we think about it in terms of co-creation, shared authority, and reciprocity, and Lauren, if you can press the first part. So we'll talk about the pre-phase. So if you really break it down, you'll find that they had no say whatsoever in the pre-phase because they did not exist in my list of narrators, right? So they had no, when I approached them, I had already been doing my field work. So I had already prepared what I was working on. I had already known what I wanted to ask. So they didn't really participate in that point at all. But then in the during phase, Lauren, I'm so sorry, Lauren, I feel like I'm bugging you every second. For the during phase, it really was completely co-created in terms of them deciding what kind of questions they wanted to be asked, deciding when we do the interviews, where to do the interviews, how long it was. It was completely open for discussion. In terms of shared authority, if I want to think a little bit in terms of tools here, I mean, I had my consent form, right? So they agreed to do the interview, they read the consent form, they agreed to review the material after, and they had shared authority in the sense that they could always take out the things that they feel uncomfortable with, they could add more information if they want later. So basically the shared authority part, in my opinion, was more about what to include and what not to include in the interview. And in terms of reciprocity, I did feel at the time that they were able to express everything they wanted, and they thanked me at the end of the interview because they said that, you know, we felt like we wanted to reflect on this process, but didn't get the time or the space before. So this was really nice. So in the interview itself, I did feel that we both came out kind of winners, if I can say it that way. Like we had a really good story documented and we felt like we were in a good place. But then when you look at the post process, it's a bit difficult here to analyze. So for the co-creation part, I feel like they did not have any say in how I produced the work, the manual that I did in the end. So I shared it with them and they liked it and all that, but they didn't really have any input in the content that I created or in reviewing the content that I created. The shared authority, I would say, again, they had a bit of shared authority, just like in the interview, in the sense that whatever I quoted from them are things that they agreed on, and I didn't include anything that they didn't want to include, you know? And then with reciprocity, it's a bit of, I put a question mark because when I was doing this and I was trying to analyze it for myself, it was a bit difficult to decide because I really don't know. It's so hard to, I think this is the, like, kind of the hardest section, if I can say it, that based on my experience at least, is that once the project is done and you share this out in the world, kind of, I think I get more credit for the work than they do, if I can say it that way. So it's my thesis, right? Or like my manual that's being recognized, and they're being recognized as a part of the manual as the narrators for sure, but they're not really, I don't think they get any direct satisfaction aside from the emotional or psychological part of them being, you know, like having the space to share their stories. There's a question here that says, can one way to measure reciprocity be in shared copyrights so they can choose to use their interviews in any way they want to? That's a really good question. We'll have some discussion like later on that, but I do think that could be definitely one way. So meaning that they also get the material and that they can use it in their own name in any other space, so they get recognition for it. I think my only comment here is that sometimes they're not that interested or inclined to use the material in this form. Is a bit hard here. Okay. Sorry, I'm on my phone, so it's a bit hard to navigate chat. I think for me, long-term reciprocity is about how knowledge is disseminated, the accessibility of the actual research. True, if you're measuring it in terms of like building knowledge, that would definitely be it. I'm just not sure if the narrators always see it that way. I think some of them do, but not everyone, you know. Okay, great, thanks. So what I want you to, I just like giving this matrix now, I just want you to take a moment and think how co-creation, shared authority, or reciprocity are not really absolute terms. So it's very hard for me to say I did this project where it's completely co-created, you know, because when you really break it down, I felt like that. It was like one of my favorite interviews because I kept saying, oh my God, it was co-created all the time. Like I didn't do anything on my own. But then when I looked at it with the pre-phase and the post-phase, I realized that I was specifically talking about the interview, maybe the content of the interview itself, but not the entirety of the process, if I can say it that way. And that made me realize how that really ties into the design of projects, right? So you could design a project and you say it's going to be co-created because in the interview, I'm going to ask the narrator to share whatever they want, or I'll give them like space to move the direction of the interview in the way that they want to. But to be honest, it's harder than that, I think, when you break it down into the whole full process. And I think also this ties to, so like my 2 points here are that they're not absolute terms. Like you need to be very specific as to like which part of the process includes reciprocity, which part it has co-created. And the other point is, I think it also ties to managing expectations of narrators. Because I feel like at least a mistake that I've got into several times was like going into a project saying, we want to do this co-creative, it's a collective project. But we have all these restrictions, right? Because there's a donor who's paying me to do this thing. And so they have like specific inclinations in terms of maybe not directing the interview process, but maybe in the form, you know? So they want you to like write an article in the end, and that's that. So I can't really go in and say it will be co-created if I'm going to be writing the article and they're not going to be writing it, right? But the interview might be co-created because there's space to explore questions and explore themes. So I think it's just good to put this in mind and realize that there's so many different layers that we have to like look into before we decide on something, if it's co-created or just shared authority or reciprocity. I think that's all I've had to say at this point. I just want to check the chats quickly. Yeah, so there's a point that talks about how if the narrators are not fully aware of the content, so they also don't necessarily know how to share it, or like can't really make use of it, I guess. We can have a moment here to hear from you if you want to share some thoughts so far before we move forward. Okay, some time. Yeah, it's this is also a good point that talks about how the different phases of the project involve different levels of shared authority, and also the narrators and the conditions might change. They kind of move between them. So maybe it's not super rigid. I agree. And I was thinking it would be interesting to go to do this like kind of matrix analysis with the narrators. Like if I'm actually might do that later. But I was thinking maybe they have input on that as well, right? So maybe what I think was co-created, maybe they say we didn't feel like we had the space, or so it might be interesting to also see with them like how they feel about it. Okay, does anyone have any questions so far, or any other points? Needs assessment, that's really good. So the idea of like reaching out to the community before and understanding what their needs are and what they would like to have before we shape a proposal or a work that we want to do or a project might actually, I agree, might totally serve their purposes. But again, I mean, the needs assessment needs to be like very community-based, and you'd be able to tap into, I guess, the different voices to be able to make it reflective of what the society needs. Definitely, elements of participatory action research can be helpful for sure, which again brings us back to the point of like the preparation phase and how much work needs to be put into the preparation phase even before the interview. So no matter like how great your interview is, there's also a lot of work. If you want it to be really collaborative as a process, there's a lot of work and effort that needs to be done beforehand. Great. Okay, so I think we can have a break. I think or should we continue? I'm not sure. Lauren,
It might be a little early for a break. I mean, it depends on how you want to structure it, but I don't feel like, because of you having to jump back and forth, I feel like
Yeah,
people
let's continue.
might be a little early.
Okay, so this is another project that I wanted to share with you, and I'll share this manual with you also towards in the material at the end. So a bit of background. So in Egypt, in the southern part, there's a region called Nuba, and it's between Egypt and Sudan, so it kind of moves along the Nile. And what happened was at different times throughout the history of Egypt, because of dams that were built on the Nile, the Nubians had to be relocated. So they went through a few displacement phases. And the project I was in, we were a group of volunteers who were like spending some time there to do some community work. And I think a few of us decided that we wanted to document their stories. So just general stories of displacement, movement, and like how that affected their culture and their life. And because that wasn't intentionally what we wanted to do when we were preparing for this project. It was more, again, community work. So some of us were doing like farming work, others were doing educational stuff, so it wasn't necessarily oral history focused. Again, I always thought about this as co-creative because I was like, we didn't even think about it. When we were there, we decided to collect stories. So we were very open to the kind of stories to receive from them. Lauren, can you get the next one? Thanks. So we did a booklet in the end with some of our reflections from the stories. And a part of it we called Voices of Nuba, where we asked them like very specific questions on like their sense of belonging, what is home, what is Nuba as a region to them. And those were some of the questions that we had used in the interviews that had guided our work. So I wanted to share some with you. So I'm sharing some voices on what is Nuba. So for Ahmed, for example, he said Nuba is the gathering, the Nile, and the blue sky. And for him, I do remember that the conversation, based on his answer, kind of went into a discussion on what is the community within Nuba, what is the understanding of collectiveness, and a lot about nature. Because when they were displaced, a lot of them had to move to other areas that were away from the Nile. So a lot of the discussions kind of went into that because that was his answer. But for Khaled, who's the next guy, he was talking also about, Lauren, if you can press the next one, thanks. He said the first thing I think of when mentioning Nuba is pride. And I do remember that with Khaled, the whole conversation went into like the value system of Nubians, and like what makes Nubians different, what are their traditions like, what has kind of from their value systems, what has remained through the displacement, what has changed because of the movement. So it kind of took us into another direction of the conversation. And then the third one, Hussein, who's also Khaled's brother, I remember he was like, Nuba is music, and Nubian music is very distinctive. And it's something kind of addictive. And once you hear it, you like it, and you keep listening to it. And I remember that his conversation was mostly centered on Nubian culture and what is Nubian music and how is it different and what kind of instruments do they use. And so we kind of had this is just a small sample, but these are 3 different forms of discussions and conversations that were brought around just because we asked the same question, what is Nuba to you, and kind of let it left it to the narrator to direct us into which way should we go deeper. So if we try and look into the matrix here for this project, which in my head, again, is one of those projects that is very participatory, if I can say at least that. For the pre-phase, it was actually, it's a bit tricky here. So I do believe that the pre-phase, there was a bit of co-creation in the sense that we did a lot of site visits beforehand. So we went to the space several times. We talked to some of the community leaders. We tried to ask them who, when we decided when we were there to do stories, they were the ones who told us who we should go to for stories, who are kind of the storytellers in these communities. And also you know, what's okay to ask and what's not okay to ask, because there's a bit of sensitivity there with the displacement and like with the different tribes. And so they kind of like guided us with that. So that's why I felt like there was a bit of co-creation in the pre-phase. There wasn't any shared authority at this point because we were going through a program, like an intercultural program. So, you know, they were just hosting us. So I don't think they really had a say in things. And I struggled a bit with the reciprocity part, but I kind of put it half because we did in the end reach out to the individuals they recommended we should reach out to. So from the community, people would say, oh, you should talk to my grandmother, or you should talk to my neighbor, or you should talk to me, you know, I have some experience with that. I remember my grandfather telling me stories. So I do feel that they did get a bit in the sense that they had the space to share the stories and like put forward the voices that we wouldn't have otherwise known, like that they existed or we should reach out to. For the during phase, I would say kind of the same. I'm not going to repeat myself, but you know, again, the questions they kind of led it, like with the voices of Nuba, as I showed you. Again, with the shared authority, it was a bit tricky. So in Egypt, people are a bit wary of signing forms, like consent forms and all that. So we did it as oral consent. I'm not sure, I think someone mentioned this earlier, I'm not entirely sure they fully understood what we were doing there, you know, but we were a group of, I mean, some of us were Egyptians, some weren't. So we were this group of like young volunteers who want to document stories of Nuba, and they were like, okay, I'm happy to share my story, but I don't think they fully understood what we were going to do with it, who's going to read this. So they were more like, oh yeah, I'm happy to share my story. And with the reciprocity, I feel like kind of like in the pre-phase, again, they were able to share a bit of their story, but I'm not sure if they would have wanted to, you know, if we hadn't gone. I'm not sure if for some of the people who interviewed, I'm not sure if this is something that they would see as a plus, not necessarily. I'm being a bit critical too here. For the post phase, and that's when I got really upset when I was doing this matrix, I realized that it was actually, they were completely excluded from the post phase. So we created this booklet in the end that has the voices of Nuba and like other insights, and most of it was in English, and then we translated it to Arabic. But I want to say that I'm sure that like 80% of the individuals we interviewed never got the booklet because they don't have internet access and because we didn't go back to that area and like shared it. Again, I put like a wrong for shared authority because even though they had given us oral consent, we didn't even like share the material with them and get their feedback on it. So I feel like they didn't really have a say in what we decided in the end. So at this point, I also have no idea about reciprocity because maybe some of their voices are heard or are there in the booklet, so people would read about them. But since this wasn't an intention for them in the beginning, or it wasn't necessarily a need, I'm not sure if there's anything that they're gaining out of it. And that made me feel very, very upset because this was a project where I really felt like, you know, they had a lot of space to share material and information. So I felt very bad about it. And I realized parts of it are flexible. So I can still share the material with them. It would need me to travel and like be there for 2 weeks and like find all the families again, but it could be done. And I think it's something that I would be willing to do if it would ensure that this project would be more participatory in the sense that they can at least be informed of what we have, you know, like produced in the end. Also, another challenge here was that we did the booklet, but we also did the movie, but we had a lot of issues with producing the movie, so we did it 2 years after. And I think that played a huge role in also getting them disconnected, you know, because it would, I'm sure some of them, if I go back now and be like, hey, we did the movie, they'll be like, who are you? And like, what movie? And do you know what I mean? It's a bit difficult because it was a very community-based thing and it wasn't structured. So I'm not sure they even remember me or my name for that matter. So yeah, I'd like to take a moment here and also like get some of your reflections. So you can unmute yourself or you can also share in the chat. I realize there's some chat also here. Yeah, there's one point here that says in the chat, about like how oral historians speak of our capacity and responsibility to amplify voices and giving voices, even though, which kind of implies that the narrators don't already have a voice, which is very true. Because some of them are already, I mean, there are always activists within communities, if I can say it that way, on so many different levels, and they don't necessarily have to wait for us to give them space to share their stories. I totally agree with that. Okay, so any thoughts so far? Yeah, so there's a point about how narrators not knowing what will happen with their stories is also important for us if we want to do co-creation. I agree. So let's do 10 minutes. Would that be okay?
Okay. So we'll come back around 2:07 Eastern time. I know that's different for lots of people, but about 10 minutes. Do you want to send everybody straight into their breakout rooms, Nairy?
Yeah, I just wanted to share the questions first. Do you mind sharing the presentation quickly? And thank you everyone for your patience. I'm back on my laptop, which makes life a bit easier to navigate, but thank you for your patience with this. So my suggestion in the breakout rooms, I initially had 2 questions that you can choose from, but I think since we're doing good with time, we can actually have a bit of a longer time, and you can try and answer both questions if you'd like to. So the first one is, how can we work towards ensuring reciprocity post an oral history interview or project? So it's basically the section where I always had a question mark there, because I feel that's one of the hardest, in my opinion, at least to achieve, or hardest to measure maybe. So I thought it would be useful if we can brainstorm together how we can maybe work with in the planning phase at least, and also maybe after implementation, like how we can try to ensure that there's some sort of reciprocity once the project is done or the interview is completed. And the other question was more practical tools. So what are the possible tools that you could suggest or that you have used, which I think some of you have already started sharing in the chat, for co-creation, shared authority, and reciprocity? So what have you done to be able to ensure any of those at any level of or phases of the project or interview? And they could be tangible tools, so like a consent form, or a site visit, or so it could be something very tangible, or it could be more, I think someone had mentioned that they were just going back and like telling people telling their narrators where they are with their project and what they've been using the stories for. So it could be things like that, like more maybe, I don't want to say psychological, but I will say psychological for lack of a better word at this point. But yeah, so you can go anywhere between like very practical tools to more philosophical approaches on how these could be achieved. So I think we can also give this, like both questions, maybe half an hour, so there's time to work with that. And yeah, Lauren just shared in the chat a Google document that you can put in your thoughts or whatever you decide on. We'll have some time after to discuss this together as a group. So the Google document is just there to help you if you'd like to put in your thoughts. Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Thank you, everyone. I hope you had a fruitful discussion. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you guys have been discussing. So we have some time, also around maybe half an hour, to hear your thoughts. We can start with the first question about how we can work towards ensuring reciprocity post the project or post an oral history interview. So feel free, you can either share what you talked about in your group, or you can share a thought that you have or a reflection that you have from your discussion. We have some time, so there's a bit of space that you can share whatever you want to share with us.
Lisa's raising her hand, Nairy.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I've learned a lot listening to what you've been saying, Nairy, and also what other people have been saying. And I'd like to compliment Kamal, who's actually a colleague of mine, on talking about going back, okay? Because I think that's important. especially given what we've all lived through in 2020. Because there's a whole level to most stories, whether it's relevant to include them or not, or whether it's just a matter of listening to people tell their stories about COVID as a way to build a relationship. So I'm glad that I'm learning about the reciprocity thing. I'm a photographer, so I have an easy one. I just give them the pictures, which I've already done in the project that I'm working on. Okay.
Wonderful.
But the text part is more difficult for me. That's what I'm working on now. So.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Lisa. I'm also looking at the Google document, and I see some of you have been sharing some ideas as well. If you'd like to also elaborate on that, you're welcome to do that. I'm going to read some of what's in the Google Doc. So in answering to how can we work towards ensuring reciprocity, ask what do they need, which I think is also, it's kind of very, like it's a basic thing, right? That you would say, okay, we should need to ask them instead of like trying to guess. But for some reason, I don't know why we don't necessarily ask them like, what would you like to get out of this project or out of this participation? So I think that's a pretty important question for sure, like to be able to ask them. And I think also asking kind of relates to having a communication, sort of a dialogue also with the community that you're working with, right? Because I feel like sometimes we just reach out to them to do an interview and that's it. But if we have time to have a dialogue beforehand, then we can also delve deeper into discussions of like, what would you like to get out of this? I also want it to be beneficial for you on some level. And I guess the benefit part could be tangible again, in terms of like giving them a photograph, right? Or giving them a video in the end. Or, and I do know that we've discussed this a lot within oral history of like also giving monetary compensation of some sort, which could be either that they're directly paid for participating or that you're somehow supporting the work that they're doing, you know, so like you donate to the institution that they're supporting or to the community center, or so that's also like one thing that people have sometimes explored, which is sometimes could be a bit controversial. One other thing that's here is like ask what resources we have that they could use, so training or technical assistance. I know in one of the breakout rooms, someone was talking also about capacity building. So that could be one thing. So maybe the reciprocity could be in a learning kind of thing where you kind of like give back by teaching them something that you know that they need in their work, I guess. If I'm not explaining this well, you're welcome to also like explain it. Making connections between movements and initiatives, possibly through archives. So maybe building on their network or making connections, larger connections. Equitable legal agreements, definitely. Ensuring access, definitely. That's also very important. And from the chat, we discussed the conflict between doing it as commission versus doing it for self, and if reciprocity can be there. And the conflict between what historians will need in the future and what the narrator wants. That's definitely another thing. I guess when you're working on your own, like on your own project, you kind of have the space to be more flexible and also be more open to changing things based on their needs, as opposed to when you're being asked to do something for a job or there's a specific project that's expected. And so people are not always open to having like changes in the framework. I agree with that. If you're okay, if you're okay with that, could you explain a little bit more what you mean about the conflict between what historians will need in the future and what the narrator wants?
So we talked about, so I'm a historian of African-American history, and if there is this ability for co-creation and authority, then if the narrator, after speaking to something, doesn't want that to be recorded or released because of embarrassment or what it might mean to the family and so forth, and then as the or historian or documentary person to then just erase it based on that history is gone. And because I deal with African American history, and we already know, especially dealing with everyday people or blues people, their voices already are limited. And so if we get this rich oral history, and then the narrator is like, I don't really feel like, I don't, then that would be lost. And then we have to then, because I deal with about 100 years ago, and trying to figure out what they were actually trying to say is hard to get at. And so 100 years from now, they're going to have that same kind of problem, because usually the people who keep records are going to be the black bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie or the aristocracy, right? And so how do you get those everyday people voices? And if we are doing this oral history and we're capturing those everyday people voices, and then they say they don't want that voice to be captured anymore, because of whatever that means, and then that will be lost if we then listen to it. And so that's what I mean by that conflict.
Right, thank you. I'm wondering if anyone here has some ideas on that in terms of, I'm sure this has come up like in a lot of the work that we do. I'm just wondering if people have found ways to work with that. Like, what do you do if you have recorded something that you feel is really valuable, but then the narrator asks you to take it out for, for any reason that they would not want to include it? I know I have some ideas, but I want to hear from you first if you have any. Sure, Lynn, go ahead. You're muted though, Lynn.
I had a narrator who is part of the advisory board for the project. So she's like co-presented about the project with me. And all that to say that she has a kind of a deep understanding of the project, right? So not just a narrator who's been interviewed. And we've had many conversations about the project. And anyway, she, in her second interview, because I give the narrators the option of being interviewed as many times as they want to get what they want out there. And in her second interview, she, in the first and second, she went through her transcript and she wanted me to delete something that I thought was super crucial and super important. And so, and I had promised all of the narrators that anything they want to take out, they could take out. So I could not say, I could not debate that with her, but I did tell her why I thought it was important. But I prefaced that by saying, I'm not trying to change your mind, but I want to tell you why I love this so much. And I asked her to share with me what was it about that made her uncomfortable, because it was more a political analysis that she had. It wasn't like a personal information that could be embarrassing or challenging. And then in the first case, she said, well, I just don't think that's important. But I didn't think you would think it was important. And I just want to delete things that I don't think are that important. And then the second thing, she felt that it could be misconstrued and that she would be accused of being bringing too much about race into the question. And she's a Black woman, and I thought it was a brilliant analysis of how Black women are more subject to becoming homeless than any other group, which is true in New York City where we are. And she was afraid that it would be misinterpreted as her being overly racializing things. And then we had this really big discussion about how it is a racialized situation. But that if she wanted to take it out, I would take it out. And so it led to, in both cases, a really great conversation. But I felt like I had to really tiptoe around not wanting to impose on her what I thought she should do. And so trying to figure out how to have a conversation without that kind of privilege and power, at least acknowledging that it's there and not pretending that it's not. And she also later came back, like a couple months later, and said, you know, I've been thinking about this. And so I think the ongoing relationship with narrators can really play a big role in this question, because we do sometimes have to give more thought to something than just one question and answer kind of exchange. That's kind of how our minds work, you know, and relationships work. And so if we can do that in the way we think about narrators and our relationship and the project design, I think it leads to different conversations and different results.
Thank you, Lynn. Thanks for sharing that. Does anyone else have any thoughts or comments? Gaia? I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing the name right, sorry. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me there? Because I kind of pulled out my jack, so I'm not sure if you can hear me.
Yeah,
right?
no, no, we can hear you now.
I mean, I might sound a bit controversial, but I'm interviewing teachers who are very clear. Teachers are always great interviewees, and they're giving me the experiential reality of keeping schools open during wartime in Sri Lanka. They're all very happy to share their view with the world. They know their interviewees, I'm talking about context. Yeah, it's very context dependent, isn't it? How much does the interviewee understand of the context within which you approach your oral history project? So if they have already bought into that and understand what you are trying to achieve, then you have already settled a lot in that research design. I'm interviewing a professional group of teachers because I want to keep parameters and produce a piece of history, which will then talk across the lines, speak to armed forces, teachers, educators, and the students, all who were involved in that. Now, when you do that, you hold the right to the context. You're not, so in my context, I'm not going to ask them, are you happy with everything I've told them? Whatever you tell me, I will anonymize your name. So then you're telling them that the sensitivity of what they are discussing is not going to come back to their door. So that's one way that I dealt with second thoughts, third thoughts, family problems, issues, sensitivities, that I anonymize them, and possibly posthumously, if the situations change where those threats, or there's no exact threat, but when, say, 100 years pass, then those people who want to really look at the archives will be able to find the actual name with permission. But I think it's important to know that this is not writing someone's autobiography or memoir. You are holding a context within your hand, and you have to wield that responsibility to say, I decide that this is very good content, and I decide how I sensitively handle it. But I don't go back and forth and show them everything that they've said, because their name is not going under it. But at the same time, I write letters and say, this is wonderful. And I quote back from their interviews to them, so they know that what they say is going into a much larger project. And mine is not about identity, mine's about how phenomenon affected the lives of a community. So I'm dealing with things in a very different way.
Thanks for sharing, Gaia. I do believe strongly that, again, each project has its own specificity and its own context, for sure. And I feel if we're honest and open about this early on with the narrators and they agree to be a part of it, then it's very different if I approach a narrator saying, you'll be involved in every part of the work that I'm doing. And on other projects I've been in, we didn't even say that. We'd say like, whatever you tell me today is what I will use. And are you okay with that or not? Because of like time constraint. Or I know the individuals I interviewed for NUBA, for example, they couldn't care less about, like they would never check the material that I send them. Like no way, you know, like they wouldn't listen to an interview, they wouldn't read a transcript. So it was kind of understood from the beginning early on that they won't be involved in this process. And if anything, that put more responsibility on me because I had to be the one like deciding on things, on like what to include, what not to include. I just want to add one point here. I think it's also good to realize the red lines, like where do we stop and where we don't. There was one point in the chat about like Palestinian refugees in Jordan afraid to record like their Nakba stories because of repercussions for their families. And I do agree that for some projects, it's so sensitive that I've worked in some projects with migrants where even just anonymizing their story would not be enough because it's kind of known within the community that this incident happened to this particular person, right? So anyone from their extended family who listens to the story would still know that it's this person. I do have some suggestions for alternatives that we can work with, but I wanna hear, Joanne, you have your hands up, right?
Yes.
Go ahead, yeah.
Thank you. We actually had an interesting philosophical conversation. So while we usually focus in oral history on the rights of the narrator and placing the narrator as central, which is of course your talk today, your presentation, we were like, well, what if the narrator and the interviewer are actually kind of vis-a-vis the community for which this oral history is going to be used? What's the rights of that community? So how does that community share all these reciprocalities and shared spaces? So it was a different way to ask the question that DL raised earlier, to look at it actually from a completely different lens, from the lens of the community who's not just a passive audience, but is also involved in the making of the meaning. So then when you look at it from that perspective, how does that shift the shared authority between the narrator and the interviewee? I mean, the narrator and the interviewer. So we try to shift it around and look at it differently. That was just something we started talking about.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Joanne. And I think that like that puts, like, how do you say this? It just puts a whole other layer of preparation for your work, right? Because there's so much that you can do to involve the community, whether in being a part of the process or reviewing even in the end. That's a bit difficult. And you need to be very, I guess, clear on your boundaries on, because the community is such a big word, right? So who constitutes the community and like who has a say in what works and what doesn't, like how to move forward with the material. That's always a big thing, for sure. A few things that we have worked on in some projects I was in was I think the red line thing again. So if it's something extremely sensitive and the person asks to take it out, we just take it out. So, you know, if they say like the name of a person that they want to remove or something that's very personal to them or an experience that doesn't really, and I guess that's a bit it's a bit different from what was shared earlier. So if it's a part of the story that is not crucial for the history of it, you know, and it's a personal thing that they want to take out, then I guess that's a lot easier to decide on, as opposed to if you feel it's a part of the historical narrative. And for that, I think we were always asked, like, can we get this story from someone else? Like not this particular person's story, but like the story that would give the same meaning, right? So if you want a story that talks about racial discrimination, and if he doesn't want to say about this specific incident, but can you get it from someone else? Especially if you're doing a collective, like a big oral history with like a lot of individuals, I think that usually it usually works out in the end somehow that you get these points from different people. So if one particular person wants to take it out, you can easily take it out, but it would still remain within the record. And another thing that in the project that I was currently working on in the educational reform, it was a bit hard because some students and teachers are very critical of the national system. And we wouldn't want to include that because it might create problems for them in the future. So we did decide together as researchers that we might include things as like our field notes or as our research analysis, you know? So without particularly saying these are stories, but we would still include the analysis of these points. Like these are the themes that came up, but I don't necessarily ascribe them to specific interview. So that's not probably as powerful as it remaining in the person's voice, but we would still at least include it in the analysis of the work. So it could remain within the historical record in one form at least. Yeah, these are the thoughts I had. Anyone else? I'm not sure. I don't think I'm seeing all the screens at once, so I'm sorry if I'm missing anyone. So I'm also reading the chat. Okay, so someone said, like, a narrator asked me to delete her oral history. I gave it a lot of thought and discussed it with my colleagues. Ultimately, I decided to give it back to her. She revoked consent. I thought it important enough to avoid her contract with the institution. Fair enough. I mean, narrators have the right, I guess, to maybe decide that they didn't want to do that. And I'm ashamed to say I've gone through that. I mean, I work with oral history, so I kind of understand that. But when I'm interviewed, I sometimes get very critical. And I've had instances where I heard my interview and be like, no, I don't want to put that in. I don't know why, I just don't feel comfortable, you know? And then I feel very sad saying this because I'm an oral historian, I should understand, but I'm like, sometimes you just don't want to, you know, like I talk about my mom for like 20 minutes in the interview, like I don't want her to ever hear that, so I don't want to put that in. I mean, even though I said good stuff, but like in general, it's just embarrassing. Again, there's another point, because our participatory oral history research project is about an organization with its leaders. We separated the project legally because political liabilities could result from the interviews in the future, and we didn't want the organization to have veto power, but to have plausible deniability. Right. Okay, that's very good to look into, like to make sure that legally you can be held responsible or accountable for it, I guess. Yeah, I agree. I think, yeah, I mean, for the sake of historical record, I think we could still include any information we get, but in a way that doesn't offend or insult the narrator, I guess, one way or another. Okay, anyone has any final thoughts before we move forward? Okay, great. Okay, I think we can go back to the presentation. Yep, thanks, Lauren. Okay, so there's one question. Sorry, yeah, we should go with that question first. There's a question about how sensitive we are to issues if the story is about an agent of a crime or an agent of a crime is talking about a crime she's committed. What is the ethical limit here? It's a really good question. Oh, I forgot to, sorry, we haven't discussed the second question either, right? Sorry, okay. So let's take this point. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? If you are working within an oral history context and a story that is shared about a crime or someone who has committed a crime, how do you?
Hopefully you can hear me again now. Yeah? Okay, sorry. What did I miss?
Nothing. We lost you mid-sentence, so we just waited for you to come back.
Thanks. Okay, sorry. So yeah, we were, I was just reading from the chat the question about what to do for working with oral histories, and it's about a crime or someone who's committed a crime shares that within an oral history setting. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. What would be the ethical, like when do we draw the line, I guess, with the ethical part of that?
If it's like I'm working on another oral history project, and a lot of the life story of the person, it's going to be a memoir. He was involved with a lot of drug dealing and drug running, and he wants me to interview somebody that went to prison for many years, and they're also cousins. And so I know that, I mean, it won't surprise me, any information about a crime, and I've told the narrator, I hope he'll agree to an interview, that he'll be able to review his transcript and delete anything he wants. In this case, the statute of limitations has already passed. And so I think it's different if we know we're interviewing folks that are maybe talking about a crime, that we can handle that one way, as opposed to if something comes up and there's different, for me anyway, there's different kinds of crime. Like if somebody's talking about, like they committed a sexual assault or they beat their wife or whatever. Like I personally just, I don't know, maybe I'm an asshole, but I would have different problems with different types of crimes, and feel ethically differently about that. But I think it could be different if we go into an interview knowing this about a person, or if it comes up as a surprise, and depending on what the crime is. I don't know how other folks feel about that.
This is a complicated issue, I think. For one thing, different states have different laws about what you have to report and what you don't have to report. Now, you know, laws are not the same as ethics, but they do matter. And it also seems to me that you're right, that it's different if the subject matter is known ahead of time and you know you could veer into this kind of territory, or if it comes up unexpectedly. But part of the process, I think, of informed consent is that people understand that this is presumably going to be made public. They have the final say at the end, of course, but hopefully a good process of informed consent that doesn't just happen at the beginning, but that is a process through the interview process, leads people to have some sort of filters, that they don't say things that could presumably put them or other people in jeopardy. Again, it's no guarantee. And I think our job then is to remind people that, do you really want to talk about this? We know from the Boston College case that interviews can be subpoenaed. That's serious. Are you willing to go to jail to protect your interview? You know, are you? So I think it really demands that we think through options ahead of time and be very attentive to consequences as these issues come up.
Wonderfully said. Thank you.
Yeah.
Guy, had
comes up
your
in class. I mean, these questions always come up. It's like, what, you know, the worst case scenario, what would I do? And they're fun, that's a silly word, but they're interesting to talk about, but they are really very serious.
They are. Gaia, you had your hand up. I don't know if you still want to share.
Actually, I mean, Linda Schultz has brought in every aspect of this. I was thinking of the time when they excavated the interviews and wanted in what was said in the interviews then to be used in evidence. And that was the instance that Linda referred to. But what I think is, before you start interviewing, one tactical thing is to sit down and do some preliminary interviews around. It's just a practical thing. I did some preliminary interviews to see what came out and what was considered in those preliminary interviews as sensitive, because when you interview, say, well, maybe 6 key people, they would start referring in their interviews to certain events. And then you have a good idea on judgments and decisions that have to be taken on how to deal with content before it came up. And then you could discuss this with the interviewee before and say, look, this is how we are going to deal with this. And that sometimes helps, that things are not reported sensationally in the middle of the interview. So as we were discussing in the breakout room too, I'm sorry we didn't do the document, but we had a very healthy discussion, the 3 of us. I want to just plug that in. But so Ebru was doing some work, you know, as a psychologist, sorry, Ebru, I'm from Turkey, and I'm from Sri Lanka. And Melody was from Colombia, and we're talking about these issues of how the research design has to take care of these thoughts before it actually comes up. You have to act very sort of proactively think, what do we do when this issue comes up? And are we looking at the massacre, or are we looking at something else and hoping that, well, events of the massacre might come in, or events of the traumatic event, or the events of the killing might come. But are we looking at the killing, or are we looking at how this community dealt with the killing? So then you know what your entry point into the interview is. It's about design, I think, a lot, and ethics, and to know that, it would come up.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that came up in one of the breakout room discussions as well, like knowing your goals, I think, and that is a part of it. So it's not, the goals are not necessarily just the framework that you're working in, but also what you want to get out from the story. So is it the impact of this specific incident, or is it the actual like description of the incident? Or like you said, I think that also puts it in perspective and helps us with framing the questions as well. So we don't ask about things that we don't need to know about and get into details that we don't need to know as well, whether they're sensitive or not. Thank you for that. So that kind of moves us into the second question about sharing tools, possible tools for co-creation or reciprocity or shared authority. If anyone wants to share anything additional that we haven't discussed so far. I see in the Google Doc there are some really interesting things, but I'll give you a chance to talk first before I read them. Okay, I'll read the document then. One tool, important skill or consideration is who the interviewer is for an interview. When choosing an interviewer, consider what is the positionality of the interviewer, what impact will this have on the interviewee or participating in the project, the context and lived experience of the interviewer will affect the ability of the interviewer to co-create, engage with the shared authority and reciprocity, and considering who the interviewer is, the role in terms how the interview will be able to engage with them based on their perceptions of each other is an important tool to consider. I think this is really, really important. On the one hand, as mentioned in the in what was shared, on the one hand, it's good to understand what you're bringing in as an interviewer and also your biases. I think I would add this to it. So I remember in some of the interviews we did, it was in a local community. I remember like the first thing we were told when we were sitting with some of our like community leaders to help guide us through the interviews before, like just give us like their suggestions and feedback on what we were doing. They like automatically said, first of all, like no females should do the interviews because we were going to interview like elderly community leaders in a very conservative area. And they said that they would be very embarrassed talking in front of a woman. So they would not feel comfortable talking to a female, and they would definitely not feel comfortable talking to a younger female, which was the case for us. We were mostly students and they were much older. So they were like, you could do all the work that you want, you can prepare everything, but it has to be a man who goes into, you can accompany them, but you can't be the one asking the questions. And I remember some of us were like, no, I mean, no, we're in like, it's a modern world, we're definitely asking, we're nice enough and all that, but we could see them shut down like when we were talking to them, just because like you talk to him and the guy would address the guy next to me, and it was and I feel like it wasn't necessarily in a disrespectful way. It was, if anything, he feels that he's being respectful by not like addressing me, and he feels that he should talk to a man, and that this is just so much cultural like points at stake here. And I remember that and when I was reading this now, it kind of triggered that. I think it's really important to know where you're coming from, how they would take you as an interviewer. Same thing with the project I'm working on now with the students, because we were talking to younger students. Some of them are like high school students. When we were getting consent from their parents, some of them said, like the parents of female students, they said we would prefer a female researcher to talk to the student rather than a male researcher. And if there's a male researcher, we would like to have a female researcher with them. I'm only focusing on gender here, but in general, it could be anything. It could be your background. It could be that you One issue we have here is accent as well. So like different areas in Egypt have different dialects. And so they would prefer to talk to someone with their own dialect as opposed to someone who speaks in Arabic that sounds different to them, because they would feel that they're a bit alienated. So there are all these considerations to take in for sure. And I think that's a really good thing to consider before going into an interview, and to consider like the co-creation point. The other point that's here that says, how can we ask of the interviewee what is important to you or in your life? Especially if they have different ways of experiencing their life than us. So how can we engage with this question for people who may have primary ways of engaging with the world that are nonverbal? Sorry, I'm just going to read it just to understand. Okay, so it's basically like try to understand what would be their best way to express themselves and to express their experience. So maybe speaking in an interview might not be their best way. And so it would be good to explore different ways of expression. I totally support that. I think in some of the oral histories I did in Puerto Rico, people would share art, either like music that they've created or art pieces that they've created. And sometimes they would be better able to articulate their experience by explaining the art that they've produced, because this is where they put like their kind of heart and soul into it. And so speaking or like, you know, saying words together isn't the best way for them to express themselves. I think that's a really good point. Thanks for putting this up. Okay, great. Does anyone have any other final thoughts before we move on? No, we're good. Okay, great. Lauren, can we go back to the presentation?
You want the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. So just to wrap up what we've been talking about so far, it's pretty simple, but I want to make sure that we kind of put it together, I guess, is that I really think it's very important, either when we're designing early on or after we started conducting a few interviews, to try to look back into our process as pre, during, and post the interview itself. And then to try and see the different elements of co-creation, shared authority, and reciprocity between the three. I think it's very realistic to say that in some points, maybe you won't be able to achieve some of that, and that's fine. But I think it's worth the exercise of trying to see if we can incorporate it for as many layers and levels as we can. And I think it really pays off. And if with some planning, maybe, and discussions, you could easily make it work and make it a little bit more co-created and have more shared authority than you would if you don't think through it in that way. Again, I'm just reminding you that these are not absolute concepts. I really now have my doubts of like anyone saying, oh, I did a co-created project. I'd be like, what? Wait, how? Like every layer was it co-created? So I think we also need to be very aware of how we say this, how we frame it, and how we explain it to the narrators and to the community that we want to work with, because they might have very different expectations to what we mean by co-creation or by shared authority and all that. And so it's really worth the time and effort to make sure that they're on board with you on these concepts, and also in understanding which parts and which phases of the project or process that they're involved in and have a say in like the decision making of it. That's it very quickly, just to talk again about project design. I shared with you like before the session a link to this video and also a blog post, but I wanted to say quickly that for the blog post, I mentioned there was a story about a man that we wanted to interview who made us like wait because he wanted to dress in his like traditional clothes and like hold a poster up when we were taking pictures of him. And he was one of the people interviewed for the Nuba project. And I remember like after that day, I was like, oh my God, this is so co-created. Like he did everything he wanted, right? But as you had seen when I was trying to make sense of it later, he didn't get the material in the end. Like he actually didn't get the booklet that we have made, even though I tried to reach him because he was actually one of the easier people to reach, but I was never able to send him the booklet. So yeah, there are just different layers of that. For this video, this is actually one project that I'm happy with, that I would say that I think has achieved a little bit more than the ones that I have worked on before, because it's a bit hard for me to keep sharing like all my difficulties with work. So this is, for those of you who haven't watched it, it's a very short video, it's 6 minutes. And it's me interviewing my friend, whose name is Omar, whose name's right there, about his relationship with his grandfather. So he basically, he had spent a lot of his time with his grandfather, and his grandfather passed away, and he was talking about the idea of how you can keep someone alive through his memories. A little bit deeper than that, but that's like the very brief explanation. Can we move to the next slide, Lauren? Thanks. So I do feel that this was really a collaborative process. And even when I was doing the credits, like on the movie, like at the beginning, I put his name, and at the end, I also put his name there, because he really took a big part in planning it with me. So basically, I interviewed him online because I was doing my master's at the time. So I was in the US, and he's from Egypt. But we did the interview online, but then he sent me all the material I used in the project. Like any images that I had used, he was the one who sent it. And I think that actually at the beginning, I thought that was a kind of a disadvantage for me, because I wasn't there and I would have liked to go and take pictures myself. But I think it actually worked well in the end, because I didn't have access. He was my only access point. And that actually gave him much space to be more empowered, I guess, from his side. We can move to the next point. So this is it. Like, as you can see, there are a lot of circles. So a lot of things have been achieved, thankfully. But for the pre-phase, so his story was something that I wanted to document very early on. So he's always known that I wanted to document it. And so before doing our interview, we had a lot of discussions on like which part of the stories with his grandfather he would mention in the interview, what he would want to do with that. We talked a lot about the form of the production. So I did tell him I wanted to do it as a video, and we wanted to do it more artistic in a way. He was extremely on board. He really wanted to get the story out there. Like, he was always telling me when we met, like how he wanted to document the story of his grandfather, his relationship with him. And he thought that was, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you can hear the noise around me, but we're in Ramadan, and there's this like troupe that moves around the street that plays music like at night. So I'm sorry if it's disturbing you. They're gonna leave. They just like move around the houses. Yeah, so I feel like I feel comfortable saying that there is some sort of reciprocity in it, because he was really interested in getting the story out there in general. The only thing that I did cross on was the co-creation in the post process, just because I ended up working on the video because I had the deadline for my class, and he didn't see it until I finished it. So that was the one thing that I think I failed in. I did send it to him after, and he loved it, and he's been sharing it on his own, like with his friends. So it's not extremely bad. But I also feel for the reciprocity part that I'm still getting more recognition than him for that. So that's why I kind of put it half. He's sharing it around, which makes me feel comfortable saying there is a bit of reciprocity in it, because he likes it and he's enjoying like sharing it. But I do feel that I'm still getting more recognition for it than him. But in my opinion, this is the one project I think that I've worked on for oral history so far, since I've ever started, where I feel comfortable saying this was a bit of a co-creative project, and it wasn't entirely me, and I didn't entirely like gain from it, as opposed to my narrator. Yeah, I think that's it for me so far. Does anyone have any questions or any thoughts before we move on? No, we're good. Okay. Is there a link? Yeah, I'll share the link again in an email. I think it was sent to you earlier, but I'll share it again. We'll share like an email with all the links in the end. Again, I'll make sure the video's in it as well. So I'm kind of done for today. I'm very happy that I'm done earlier than I had expected. We'll have some time for Q&A in the end if anyone has any questions, but I just wanted to go quickly over the goals for today. I kind of broke them down into knowledge, skills, and general attitudes. And I wanted to share with you all this. I'll send you now. This is like a feedback form. I'd really appreciate it if you can fill it out and be as honest as you feel like. I'm very happy to get feedback. I'd love to do this kind of work again in different spaces. So I'm always happy to get critique as well. So yeah, I encourage you to take a moment. I'm not going to say a minute. It might take more than a minute, but just a moment to fill out the form. We'll share it also in the final email. So if you don't get to fill it now, we can still fill it after. Yeah, I think that's it. So we have some good time for questions if anyone has any questions or thoughts or reflections. And I want to say thank you, a very big thank you to Lauren for all her help and support. I feel like I was like the most demanding person, but thank you. So yeah, feel free to ask any questions you have, share any thoughts before we conclude. Yeah, I'll share all the material that I've talked about in an email. No worries.
This may be like a really impossible question to answer, but it's just on my mind right now. You know, something that I've taken a lot away from this workshop. Thank you so much for offering it. And I especially loved the interactive nature of it. So that was really wonderful. I'm wondering, you know, if there's already some kind of like database or, I don't know, resource list or hub around, you know, what some of the key things that we've talked about, or, you know, a list of oral history projects to draw from, or just, you know, resources to kind of be connected to, or if that's something that we can be co-created as a result of these conversations. I know that would be really wonderful for me, you know, moving forward, because even in my breakout room, I felt like there was a lot of really wonderful knowledge and wisdom being shared about people's own experiences, but also just the projects that exist that I might not have any idea about because of the context that I'm woven into. So yeah, just throwing that out there.
Thanks. I think we can share, I'm trying to think like practically. I think we can definitely share like a Google folder. And if anyone feels comfortable sharing a project that they've worked on, and maybe do like a document next to it with this matrix of the pre, during, and post, and like just tell us in their own opinion which parts they feel were done or not done. I think it might be nice to read that and be able to contact the person maybe later if you have questions or ideas. That's the one thing I can think of right now. If there's anything else, Lauren, do you want to add?
No, I was just going to say that stuff, we can send a link to that in a Google Drive and send a link to that in the follow-up email. I know in our most recent past workshop, Crystal also shared a spreadsheet that people just added like their name, their email, and like, you know, what maybe they have some expertise in and what maybe they have a question about. So, you know, if people wanted to, you know, connect through that kind of spreadsheet, we can also add that into that folder. And then just as another plug, the OMA website has a lot of blog posts of, you know, students with various expertise, you know, reflecting on their work. And then also the site that Nairy's film is on has some other posts about people's work and projects that you could browse through and see if any stand out to you. You want to contact the person. That might be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's, thanks, Lauren. Yeah, so Google folder and possibly a spreadsheet. Yeah, and if you're open for people to reach out to you again about your project, then you can put your contact as well. I think that would be very good. Hopefully you won't be bombarded with a lot of questions. Anything else? Any other thoughts or questions? Consent forms, there's a question about consent forms. It's so hard. I mean, okay, if I answer personally, and then we can hear also if anyone else has any of their thoughts. But for me, consent forms are very difficult. I remember when I was in the program with the oral history program, that was like my first question, because consent forms don't work in Egypt. Like they just don't, like people don't understand legal liabilities. People don't, it's just, they get really scared about this, you know? So people would be like, if you want me to sign a paper, then this is something very serious and I'm very worried. But if I tell you on the record that I'm okay with it, then that's okay. And to try to explain that it's the same, I just need the paper for my like university or whatever is just very hard. Unless you're talking to someone who's, you know, a fellow researcher or a scholar, but like within the general community, it's not something that we regularly do. And I feel like when I was in the US, it was so different because it's the opposite. In the US, people would feel more secure. It would be very shady if you just ask them to do stuff with an oral consent and they'd be like, so why don't you have a document for me to sign? And I thought for me, that was very interesting, like how cultures are so different with that. I actually think I'll go with what was mentioned in one of the Google forms. I feel in the Google Doc. I think asking the people might work. Maybe asking them what kind of consent would work with them might actually be good. I think for some, in the project I was working on with the teachers and students, I remember we put multiple variations. So we said for teachers, we would do a consent form because teachers are a bit more academic. I mean, that's our assumption. But with parents, we would do an oral consent form. And we would get like a student's assent first. So I talk to the student and then get the consent from their parents. And I think some of us recorded the consent and some didn't. So I didn't record their consent because I thought the parents would be because we did it offline. We did it via phone. So I wasn't able to see them. So I felt it would be so weird if I just called them and be like, I want to record this call. They just wouldn't take it well the first time. So I remember I would just tell them, are you okay? And they would say yes. And I would just write down the date and the name of the person who took it. And as a team for the project, we decided that we are okay with that. So we will move forward with this as consent. But with teachers and with other individuals within a more structured framework, then we can send them a document because maybe then they wouldn't they wouldn't take it in a bad way. They would actually feel more comforted like having to sign a document. I'm not sure if this answers your question. I hope it does. Sorry, there's a lot of stuff in the chat. I'm gonna try and catch up quickly.
Nadi?
Yeah.
Yes. That sounds very applicable and culturally respectful and understandable. The only thing that comes up for me or gave me a gut feeling was sometimes folks, people don't understand the implications, the legalities behind things. And so if that's not explained because that is not their sort of arena, I just think that's also really important to be able to give people a deep understanding of how this protects them or doesn't, and that being able to be part of the conversation, because I think that's breaking down the barriers of access and privilege that is really important in the work.
Yeah, I agree. I'm sorry, I did not mention this, but we anonymize everyone we're interviewing. So I think that's why we didn't go further than that, because either way, I think as Guy mentioned earlier, we already know it'll be anonymized. But in cases where it isn't, I agree, of course, we definitely need to spend the time and energy explaining this. And I think this also is relevant, so like the general legal repercussions, but also I remember I had this conversation once about also investing the time in explaining what it means to have your interview online. Because you'd ask people, are you okay having your interview online? And they would just say yes.
Yeah, about like getting your interviews online. I think that's also pretty important to explain because people don't fully understand what it means. Sorry, I'm getting the. Okay, sorry. Yeah, that they don't fully understand what it means for your interview to be online, especially if it's a community that's not that doesn't have direct access to internet. So I completely agree with what you're saying. I think it's definitely worth the time and effort to explain that if you feel that there's need for them to, if you feel that they do not understand what you're saying and they're just agreeing but without fully understanding what that means. Yeah, phones, I can't really see if anyone has their hands raised or not, but if you want to share anything else, please go ahead. I think there were a few questions in the chat as well. There's a question about transcripts. So what are the approaches for creating transcription of interviews? Any ideas on that? Does anyone have any suggestions or ideas on how transcripts can be more maybe expressive or representative of individuals?
I've had narrators get upset at their transcript, even though I did quite a bit of audit editing. So it's not just like a raw transcript. So for example, I say constantly. Other narrators might say things like sort of or like, and so I would remove quite a bit of that, not all of it. So it still sounds like them. But I've had narrators be upset at how they may be perceived because every sentence wasn't grammatically correct, for example. And so even when you explain that before the interview and what you're going to get, and you can approve it or disapprove it, I think it's been really challenging for some narrators to see their words in print and just not be happy with the way our words can be transcribed. And so I think sometimes, speaking to Evelyn's point, when we explain things, it's not necessarily how people remember it when the actual thing happens. And so I find it really important to, and this has been hard with COVID, to sit down physically with people, to give them the transcript and just actually have that conversation again, that this is not grammatically correct. It's more how we sound written down. But that's been a big sticking point, and it's something that I didn't anticipate ahead of time.
Thanks for sharing, Lynn. Yeah, I've had also the opposite sometimes. So for projects where I had to do formal transcripts because they will go into a publication or something like that, there was always this conversation of like, I'm sorry, I have to edit it to make it look more professional, which is so bad because that means that you're not speaking in a professional manner, right? And it's not like that. It's just that there's sometimes there are restrictions for how you can publish something, and so you have to follow it. And I think it's definitely worth investing time again in explaining this. So whether you're keeping it as is because you want to keep the natural dialect of the individual and like the way they speak included, or you're going to have like a standardized format in the end that is more academic. And so you're going to have to edit them all for whatever reason, right? And then get their consent for that as well. Do they want it to be, because I know personally I wouldn't want to get my transcript formalized, if I can say it that way. I wouldn't want it. I want it to be more expressive of how I speak. But for other people I've worked with, I've interviewed in this process, they were happy. They would be like, oh no, I trust you to like make it look more professional. That's completely fine. So I think also people take it differently. It's important to get their opinion, like direct opinion on that. Sure.
And this goes to your point, I can't say your name, Nairy, of earlier when you did the context, right? When you did the circle around and the layers and layers and layers. And I think that as interviewers, it's very important to understand that there's so much more that meets the eye depending on the subject that you're interviewing. And you know, there's so much oppression with people's stories and many times with who you're interviewing, that when people say those things, they come from layers, right? Of how you're seen and how you're, and having this opportunity to be presented or to be heard comes with all of that. So
Yeah.
I can see where that story of not wanting sort of how I speak to be, you know, documented that way, and that what that could bring up for different communities and people. But yeah, taking all that into consideration versus, no, don't worry. It's like really listen to what that is, because it adds to the story of the narrator.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
The other thing that, you know, there's audio. So some of the narrators that I've interviewed, they're amazing orators and very effective as public speakers. And so some of the narrators haven't wanted to take the time, or would say things to me like, no, you know how I talk, or you know what I mean, you do it. And others have been really, really concerned with how their transcript portrayed them, their intellectual capacity, all kinds of things. And so some folks have wanted to listen to their audio instead of reading their transcript. And I think for projects where there is going to be the kind of this digital audio presence, that for me, it was a lesson I had to learn that, yeah, we're going to use these in trainings, or people are going to hear this on SoundCloud. And so maybe folks also want to hear how they sound, as opposed to just read how they sound.
Very true. Very true. I hate listening to my voice. So that's something I'm always like very wary of, like listening to the audio again. But I agree. I think people would react very differently to either. And depending on your project, I would say if you can share both, share both. If you're only going to use one of them, if you're not going to use the audio at all, then just share the transcript. So whatever the project is. But I agree. There's definitely a difference between listening to especially also if you added the audio, like kind of with the transcript, if you added the grammar and all that, if you added the audio, like to cut it or to remove parts, it's also important for them to hear it again, and like how they phrase the sentences, how the sentences are being phrased after the editing. So, yeah. Okay, I think we're almost done. I'm trying to keep up with the chat, but there's a bit of a conversation going on. So I'm a bit slow to catch up. But yeah, I wanted to thank you all for being here. I'm really sorry for all the connection issues. I promise I tested everything before, so it is what it is. I'm happy to have my phone as a backup. But thank you so much for your patience, for being here with us for 3 hours. I know it's a bit long, and for listening to the music that was on the streets. But yeah, I'd love to stay in touch. I'll send you, with Lauren's assistance, an email with some of the material, and with my email, I'll be happy to hear back from you. I'd really love it if you can fill out the feedback form. I'm really going to look into it and really follow through with any critiques I get. Yeah, Lauren, is there anything that you want to share?
No, just we have 2 more sessions two more sessions in this series. And so we have an upcoming public interview with Indigenous oral historian practitioners that will be in a couple of weeks. And then after that, we have a equity and budgeting workshop that will talk about budgeting for equity across all platforms when you're doing oral history project. So join us for those if you have time. See you then.
Thanks, Lauren. Well, take care, everyone. I wish you a happy day, evening, night, wherever you are. Take care. Bye.